Hello everyone, it's Lisa Dickey from Dickey's Cooking School, and today I am going to show you how to make cinnamon rolls. This is a recipe that you can do in one day. And here are the ingredients. You need, number one, a lot of butter. You need 1 1/4 cups of butter. If you don't use butter, you could use margarine or the Earth Balance, which is essentially margarine butter. Instead, you need 3/4 cup of brown sugar times 2. So we're gonna do it in 2 different applications. So you're gonna do that twice. You need a tablespoon of cinnamon, 2 eggs beaten, a 1/4 cup of sugar, a teaspoon of sugar, 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. That's the equivalent to one of those Fleischmann's packages. 1 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 cup of milk, 1/2 cup of warm water, and rum is optional because we're gonna make a caramel sauce for the cinnamon buns. So the first thing we're gonna do to get started is we're gonna put our milk in a small saucepan. We're gonna turn the heat on to medium, and we're just gonna let it simmer up, and then we're gonna melt some butter in that. While we're doing that, we are going to mix up our yeast and make sure that it is active and alive. Okay, to check on our yeast, we're gonna take our 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. We're going to add a teaspoon of sugar, and the reason we're adding the sugar is literally it just helps us to check soon to see if the yeast is active, because yeast loves sugar and it loves warmth. So we've got sugar in here, and now we're gonna add some warmth. We're going to add our warm water. We're gonna give that a quick whisk. And within a few minutes, you should see the yeast rise and burst and create this really lively gray sludge on top. And it will also smell, believe it or not, yeasty. Okay, our milk is warm. To our milk, we are going to add 1/4 cup of butter. And I'm just gonna smush that around to melt it. And to that butter, we're gonna add 1/4 cup of sugar. And we're just gonna let that, the heat is not on, I'm just melting it down. We want that butter melted. 4 cups of flour, but we're gonna start off just with 1 1/2. There's one. Now I'm using this with a standing mixer. You don't need it. We're making what's called a sweet dough. It's a fairly liquidy dough, and it's an easy dough to work with. It's not a lot of heavy kneading. You don't need a standing mixer to make this. You can easily make this by hand. It just is easier and looks more profesh, yeah? Okay, so to our 1 1/2 cups of flour, we're going to add our melted butter and mixed with sugar and with warm milk. And that's gonna go in there. And I'm just gonna start mixing that up. So here's the thing, I'm mixing this up. Once that's completely incorporated, then I'm gonna add the beaten eggs into it. The reason that you don't add the eggs in first and then dump the warm milk and butter mixed is because if your milk is a bit too hot and you cook the eggs, it would be kind of gross. So I'm gonna give this a little scrape. And we're also gonna hold off adding the yeast until we're 100% sure that the yeast is good. We're gonna make sure it's completely bloomed. Okay, so here we go. Now we're gonna add our eggs in. I'll give that another scrape. So if you are using a standard mixer, you're gonna want the dough hook attachment. I'll just show you what it looks like. It's kind of gloopy now, but it looks like a question mark. Okay, now we're gonna mix that in. Now we can add another 1/2 cup of flour. Slot that in there. we're gonna check in our yeast. I'm gonna show you the yeast because it's looking really great. It is foamy and filmy and active, and yeah, it's yeasty too. Go figure. Okay, let's dump that in. Gonna give it a little scrape. It's kind of, sometimes with these mixtures, they're not the most effective at the beginning stage. It's actually more effective to just use a spatula and elbow grease. Okay, let's add another half cup. You're just gonna keep adding at a half cup of a time until it's all in, and then that is it for your dough. I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Okay, we're back. Everything is mixed in, and I'm gonna pull the dough out. It's a little bit, it needs to be a little bit incorporated. It's a bit shaggy on the bottom, and it's a bit wet on top. So I'm just gonna give it a quick knead, okay? And just combine it like that. I meant to mention, I didn't say that you need to add the salt. You definitely do need to add it to the milk and the butter and the sugar mixture. You're gonna add the salt into that. So we're gonna give this just a few quick kneads, and as always, when you're kneading, you're using the palms of your hand and you're giving a fair amount of pressure. This dough does not require a ton of work. It's a nice sweet dough made with milk. There's a lot of liquid in it, so it's a pretty pliable dough. Okay, so that is our dough. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna put it into a greased bowl. We're gonna cover it with plastic wrap. You could also use a tea towel and run it under hot water and then wring it out and put that on top, and that will keep the dough nice and moist. But definitely I would put a bit of oil in the bottom of the dough to prevent it from sticking. It needs to double in size. So what you're gonna do before you put it in a bowl is take a mental snapshot of the size of your ball, and then think, okay, if this was twice the size, about how big am I looking at? Okay, but that is what your dough looks like. And we're gonna get this in a wrap, and then I'm gonna show you how to make your caramel sauce. Okay, while our dough is rising, we're gonna take care of a couple of steps. Step one is to make a caramel sauce. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna combine 3/4 of a cup of unsalted butter. And you use unsalted butter so you can control the salt. Also, sometimes salted butter has a higher water content. So you wanna make sure you're getting all that good buttery grease and not just water. So we're gonna turn that on to some medium heat and let that melt. Once it melts, we're gonna add in 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar, and we're basically gonna simmer it down, and we are gonna simmer some of the water off, and it'll thicken, and we're gonna make a caramel sauce. This caramel sauce is going to go into the bottom of the pan that you're cooking your cinnamon rolls in. So your pan could be a Dutch oven, as long as it doesn't have plastic handles. It could be a cast iron pan. It could be a large skillet that has a metal handle. It could be a ceramic pot. But today we're gonna use a cast iron pan. Okay, so we're gonna wait for that to melt. While we're waiting for that to melt, we're also going to get ready our cinnamon and sugar mix. So when we make our cinnamon rolls, we're gonna have our dough rise, then we're gonna roll it out into a big rectangle, and we're gonna brush it with melted butter, more butter. Then we're gonna put our cinnamon and sugar mix, roll that, cut them into buns, and then sink them into our caramel sauce, and then rise them again, and then we'll bake them. Basically, you're looking at about 4 hours from start to finish. Okay, our butter is melted and starting to simmer up a little bit. I'm gonna add 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and mix that in. This is a little sloppy at first because you're combining some really heavy brown sugar with butter. Okay, so what has to happen is the butter and the sugar have to raise their temperature to enough of a degree that they are actually able to combine. Look and see what happens. So what happened is I actually, just because it was getting really splashy, I used a whisk to mix up the sugar and the butter and give it a nice workout to combine it. Okay, so this is what you're looking at. You want this to be thick, to make thick bubbles. You can see that kind of foaminess, and now that's ready to go. I'm gonna turn it off the heat. For me personally, I'm gonna add a bit of rum in it because I like the flavor of rum in my caramel sauce. You don't have to add rum, it's strictly optional. You could also add vanilla syrup, you could add scotch, even better than rum in some ways, or add nothing. It's brown sugar and melted butter and mixed and beaten into a nice caramel. It's pretty good on its own, but no matter, a little rum it is, just for flavor. It's gonna bubble up a little bit, just for a moment. Smells rummy. Okay, that's all ready to go, and this is gonna go into the bottom of our pan. So we're gonna bake our cinnamon buns in this pan. And all this brown sugar and butter and a little bit of rum is gonna sit on the bottom, and we're gonna sink our cinnamon buns on top. Now the last little thing we can take care of before or while we're waiting for our cinnamon buns to rise is we're gonna mix our cinnamon and brown sugar mix for the inside of the cinnamon rolls. So this is 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar. This is a tablespoon of cinnamon. I'll use the same whisk. Just gonna break it down. You could use your fingers, honestly, if they're clean, obviously. And I'm just gonna whisk that in. You could add more cinnamon if you like it really cinnamony. I did a tablespoon, probably a tablespoon and a little bit. You could also maybe scrape in a little bit of fresh nutmeg or a pinch of nutmeg that's already mixed, and that's also really nice as well. That's it. Now all we have to do is wait for our dough to rise. See you in a bit.